Welcome back to Moral Theology. Today is Tuesday, March the 31st. This is Mr. George. This lecture is for all of Mr. Mahalik and Mr. Garrity and Mr. Salters and my classes. As a part of review and then setting a foundation for our next few steps forward, I want to begin today by talking about the family, starting from the fourth commandment, honor your mother and father. Look at the family and what the family is, both in Revelation, in the Bible, as well as in society. That might seem like a strange place to go after Mr. Mahalik's previous couple of lectures, but if we can wrap our minds around a common sense and a logical understanding of what the family is and what it does in society, and if we can wrap our minds around the Christian vision of what the family is, then we're going to be in much better shape for our next few conversations. Again, we know already each of our classes have talked about the fourth commandment, honor your father and mother. We would have talked about how all legitimate authority, whether it's from our parents or whether it's in society, teachers and coaches, bosses, government figures, how all authority is a reflection of God's own authority. In the Bible, we read about how the family itself is not just instituted by God, but is a reflection of the very inner life of God, that God in his very nature is a family, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In the first letter of John, it says God is love, but love is something that has to exist between more than just one person. So the family itself, as we experience it in society, at its very best, is meant to be a reflection of the very best of God. It's meant to be a school of love. It's meant to be something that tells us something about who God is in his very nature. Just from the perspective of logic and common sense, at least some of our classes would have talked about already how the family is the essential, fundamental unit of society. The most important things we learn in life, we learn from our family. And hopefully that's good news for us. Hopefully what we get from our families is stability, support, encouragement, challenge, that we help each other to grow even through friction at times. But again, the things that we learn at school can only really build on what we learn in our families. And if there's something missing from our family life, it's much harder to learn that later on through elementary school, middle school, through the rest of our lives. Again, by and large, what at least my observation is that most guys typically have the political views of their parents. Again, that doesn't mean that there aren't a few guys that disagree with what their parents have to say and so forth. And as much as we might not want to admit it, when it comes to politics and a whole range of other issues, a lot of times what we believe very simply comes from our family, what our family believes and how we were trained and shaped and formed. Again, just logically, even if we put religion aside or don't think about what the Bible says or Revelation says, the instinct of Christian anthropology, the instinct of logic and common sense, is that society can only thrive if the family, as the fundamental unit of society, is doing well, if individual families are teaching virtue and shaping good citizens, that if families are compromised, that if families are disrupted, that if family life in a country is not going well, that society at large is not going to do well. So just from the perspective of secular humanism, we could call it, just from the perspective of what is good for human beings in a society, here's the instinct. As society is going to follow the family. As the family goes, society goes. So on a couple of levels, by our personal actions, but also by the very structure of society, socially and legally, in the way that we think. Again, on both of those standards, if we want human beings to do well, we've got to work for the well-being of the family. So again, this is why Christians get motivated and talk so much about the notion of how we define a family. We could ask the question that's asked in so many state legislatures and that comes up so often in culture wars. Well, again, if Christians define family as the marriage between men and women and the kids that come from that and so forth, well, if two men love each other, who's to say that they can't start a family? Who's to say that that's not real love? Who's to say that we shouldn't allow them to profess that love and to be married and so forth? Who does that really hurt? Why are Christians so bent out of shape about this? Now, again, when people ask that question, there's no reason to assume that two men or two women can't love and serve and honor each other. There's no reason to assume that a gay couple can't be an encouragement and a life partner for, one for the other. There's no reason to assume that anybody has anything but good intentions. For example, when people advocate for same-sex marriage or the legalization of same-sex unions and so forth. But there's something unique about the relationship between men and women. And if what we're really about is protecting a notion of the family that's good for the human person and that helps the flourishing and the well-being of society, if we set something else up besides the marriage of a man and a woman, whether it's legally or philosophically, whether it's socially, if we set something up and try to see it as an equivalent of the marriage between men and women, marriage being the foundation of this Christian notion, this common sense notion of family, it's something that doesn't make sense. It's something that does not serve the well-being of human society. And we'll talk about a little bit why. What the family is, from this common sense natural law perspective, is the bond between children and their biological parents. Now, maybe that's not your family. Maybe you live with your grandmother and grandfather. Maybe your parents, like mine, are divorced and remarried. Maybe you live with grandparents. Maybe you don't know your biological mother or father. Maybe you're adopted. But fundamentally, the ideal of family that we talk about as Christians, that we talk about from a common sense perspective, is when children are able to live in a home with their biological mother and father, and when that home is stable. It's not a revolving door of relationships. It's not dad's home sometimes, or mom stops by here and there, or there's a new boyfriend or girlfriend, and maybe next week there'll be a different one, and so forth. The idea is that family is built on stability. And if you look at studies like this recent study from a European journal from 2017, just read the metrics, just read the research, just look at the statistics. Every metric we have of socioeconomic outcomes, financial stability, educational outcomes, every metric we have when it comes to behavior, when it comes to social wellness, the very best circumstance that we can hope for to work on success for any given child is that that child gets to live in a home where they know who their biological mother and father are, and they get to live with them, and their biological mother and father are in a stable relationship. What's that stable relationship called? Well, we call that marriage. The promise, the assumption of permanence, that there's not going to be a change, that there's not going to be a new spouse brought in next week, and so forth. Now, again, if that's not your circumstance, if you do live with adopted parents, or you do live with your grandma and grandpa, your aunt and your uncle, there's nothing to say that you can't have every possible excellent outcome that anybody else has. You can go to an Ivy League school, you can get a six-figure job right out of college, and all the rest. But that being said, just read the numbers. The statistics suggests that the best we can do, the best circumstance we can provide if we want to give our children the best shot at being successful across all these different kind of standards, all these different metrics, is if children get to live in a home with their biological mother and father, and they get to live in this common sense notion of family, where there's stability, where there's permanence. That's in fact why St. Thomas Aquinas, that great hero and thinker in the Christian faith, said that sex outside of marriage is wrong. Not because it's naughty, not just because you really shouldn't, not just because the Bible says this or that. St. Thomas says that sex outside of marriage is wrong because every child should be able to know who their father is. And what happens so often when sex outside of marriage becomes the norm or becomes the reality is that people are not in stable and committed relationships where they're prepared to raise any biological children that are the result. So what's the bottom line here? Both in our personal lives, our virtue, what we strive for, but also in society, the laws that we pass, the ideas that we promote about the family, we have to realize that family is the fundamental cell of society, the fundamental foundation, that if family life is going well, it makes society better, not just from some far-flung religious perspective, but if we can have stability in family life, if we can have health in family life, if families spend time together in a loving and nurturing relationship, if there's financial stability to whatever degree possible, it makes society better. And what's the notion of family, which seems to statistically be the best one, the best shot that kids have to achieve the healthiest outcomes, the chance to become the best possible citizens? Well, it seems to be the case across the board on the numbers and the studies and the research that when kids get to know and live in a home, a stable relationship with their biological mother and father, that they tend to do better. Again, it's not the tyranny of the Catholic Church. It's not the tyranny of Christian, conservative, evangelicals, but it's just the biological reality that there's only one relationship in the world that can result in new life, and it's a relationship between men and women. Again, that doesn't mean that a homosexual couple can't be loving and nurturing and can't be encouraging, can't be excellent partners and a support in times of difficulty. There's nothing to take away from the kind of love that anybody else can show for anybody. But if what we want to promote is the fundamental notion of family, the fundamental notion, the idea, the stable foundation for society of how biological children of parents can have the best possible chance of success and can be healthy in a society, well, then we have to promote that unique category, the one and only one relationship that can result in biological children. That's the marriage between men and women. And putting anything else in the category of marriage fundamentally compromises that. Whether we do that legally or socially, it takes away from this notion of family. It takes away from this understanding of the one unique relationship that constitutes the foundation of society. So again, bottom line, the Catholic vision of family and society. In God's plan and in the logical analysis, family is essentially human well-being. And maybe you can think of individual exceptions to that rule. Well, my family's not very healthy, or what if the dad is an abusive alcoholic? Those exceptions exist, but the law assumes that custody for each individual child belongs to the biological parents. And if they're not married, they have to have some kind of court way of figuring out to whom custody belongs and in what way. Socially, intellectually, the foundation of society is this understanding of family as essentially human well-being. Again, all other things being equal, the ideal of the family, what I think most of us probably strive for if we think about what we want our families to be someday, is that your children get to know who their biological parents are, that your children get to live in a stable home and to know the two people from whom they get their genetic material, and that this is the best circumstance that we can hope for to try to guarantee our children's well-being. So the reality is that we have to work both personally and in society to protect this notion, to advance this notion, to maintain this idea of what the family is. Again, even with the best of intentions, there are a lot of ways that people might try to redefine what a family is that isn't just an equivalent, but is something that actually takes away from this foundation of society. Once again, some important additions. Just as a reminder, what I said before, I come from a family where there's divorce and remarriage and divorce and remarriage. So I have no personal kind of judgment for anybody who comes from a family like that, or from couples that have difficulty making a marriage or relationship work. If it's your circumstance, like mine, that your family has experienced divorce and remarriage, then like me, you're good, you're wanted by God, you have value. Your family isn't any less meaningful, your parents aren't any less good people, like mine aren't any less good people. But we have to pay attention to the reality, to the natural law and common sense, as well as to what every statistic and study and metric tells us, that the best we can do for our children is to hope for that kind of stability in family life. You, if you come from divorced and remarried parents, have every chance at behavioral and psychological and social and socioeconomic outcomes that are good, that are healthy. But what we strive for next, what we choose to do as men, that's something that can be defined by this notion, this ideal of the family and the stability that the marriage of two people and the biological children result can have. It might sound like a strange pivot, but one of the things that lays a foundation for is what the church teaches about in vitro fertilization. So as most of us know, that's the process of a couple that's probably otherwise infertile and probably has gone through weeks and months and even years of trying to conceive a child using different kind of therapeutic fertility drugs and so forth. People who are unable to conceive and start the family that they want in the way that they want, a lot of times have recourse to the medical intervention called in vitro fertilization. Sperm taken from the man and eggs harvested from the woman are combined in a laboratory setting to try to create viable embryos, fetuses, new human life. And then from that laboratory setting, those fertilized embryos, those human lives, are implanted in the woman. Most of those fertilized eggs don't survive. Sometimes 20 or 30 at a time are involved when the doctor tries to implant, and since most of them do not end up being viable, most of those embryos, most of those fetuses do not come to term, end up not ever implanting on the wall of the uterus, and they die and they pass out of the woman's body, and maybe a woman could hope for one or even two of those eggs to implant. A lot of the times when you hear about things like octomoms or moms who have, septuplets and so forth, in most cases that's the result of in vitro fertilization and more than just one of those eggs implanting. Again, what are people's motivations? They usually just want to have families. They have the best intentions of being great parents and of being loving and supportive. That being said, we as Catholics do believe that IVF, in vitro fertilization, is morally wrong. We should not do it, that we can bring new life into the world in this way, but that we should not. One of the reasons why we believe it's wrong is because of the cost in human lives. So just follow the logical syllogism here. If we make a choice that causes the deaths of others, whether you're in a Saw movie or whether you're in the trolley problem or whether you go out into public and you cough on people during a pandemic, whether it's intentionally or through negligence, if you make a choice that causes others to die, then that choice is morally wrong. Not talking about war. We're not talking about self-defense. We're just talking about a case where through negligence or through purposeful action, your choices cause the death of others. IVF, in the way we practice it now, costs human lives through negligence. there are 30 or 35 fertilized eggs at a time. What's another word we have for fertilized egg? Embryo. What's another word for embryo? It's a human life. It has its own unique DNA. From the Christian perspective, we believe at that moment where in that laboratory in vitro setting, when the sperm met an egg, now you've got a new human soul that exists inside that human body, however small it might be. Because most of the fertilized embryos, most of the human lives do not come to term, we believe through negligence, IVF costs dozens of human lives. And a lot of times, again, with the best of intentions, people pursue multiple treatments of IVF because it doesn't work the first time, maybe it doesn't work the second time. Again, now we're talking about getting up into the high double digits or even triple digits of fertilized eggs, embryos, human lives that we cannot hope to sustain. And a lot of times those human lives just get left in a laboratory frozen in cryostasis because they're not implanted in a woman. Again, it's with the best of intentions to start a family, but in current medical practice, IVF results in some pretty horrifying side effects in terms of human lives lost. Here's a second point, too, on this notion of family, this logical, common sense, natural law perspective. It's a second reason why we would say IVF is wrong. If tomorrow researchers at the University of Michigan said we've found a way to make sure that IVF never, ever causes the death of one of those fertilized eggs, one of those embryos, one of those human persons. If the researchers at Michigan said that tomorrow we can make sure that if we fertilize an egg in a laboratory setting, that with 100% success rate, it can be implanted in a woman's uterus and there's never a death involved. We as Catholics, from the logical, natural law perspective, would still say that we should not pursue IVF. We should not do in vitro fertilization. Because what it does is it takes that absolutely critical bond between biological parents and their children, brought into the world through the completely natural acts of sex. It causes a rift in that notion of family. That might sound counterintuitive because IVF is all about starting a family, but because it does so in a way that separates out those pieces of a biological mother and father and the act of sex and the ability of that unique relationship to result in human life, that regardless of the good intentions, that the availability of IVF actually causes society to suffer, that it causes a detriment to human well-being. Why would that be? So our society depends on the stability of the family. And point number two in our logical syllogism here, if there's something that disrupts the stability of a family, then it compromises human well-being. If you work such long hours that you can't have dinner with your family, well, that disrupts the stability of your family and it compromises human well-being. If you cheat on your wife, well, that disrupts the stability of your family, it compromises human well-being. So whether the intentions are good or bad, if it diminishes the notion of family for you as an individual, then it hurts all of us. And again, if it compromises human well-being, whether it's killing an innocent person or whether it's stealing or whether it's something that seems perfectly innocent, but still takes away from other human beings' wellness or flourishing, then we'd say it's morally wrong. Despite the best of intentions, we would say that IVF and its practice disrupts the stability of the family. It's a slippery slope that starts in the current medical practice with the loss of many, many human lives, but it also starts by parsing out and by removing from the act of sex and the unique relationship of a man and a woman, it removes reproduction from the family stability and the family structure. Even with the best of intentions, it creates a kind of divorce or it causes a kind of chasm to exist between the absolutely essential stability of a married couple trying to bring into the world new life that they can raise in that stable relationship of marriage. And it's a slippery slope that begins to take away from that whole structure of family as we understand it from the logical, societal, and Christian perspective. It's absolutely essential to the well-being of our society, to the future of America. It's in the hands of us as citizens to make sure that we protect this notion of family. And if we remove reproduction from the context of the stability of marriage, the stability of two people being committed to each other and bringing new life into the world in the context of that relationship, then it causes disruption of family. And so even if we had a perfect method of IVF that didn't result in any loss of human life, we would still say as Catholics we should not practice IVF. Just follow the logical, common sense results to their conclusion. It's like a dystopian future book or movie. It's like a 1984 or a Brave New World. It disrupts the fundamental notion of family if we remove reproduction from the context of a stable, committed relationship like marriage between a man and a woman, the one relationship that's able to result in biological children. Once again, maybe some of us know that we're the result of IVF. We use a kind of crass term, test tube babies, to describe children who are conceived in this way. If you or anybody you know came into the world through IVF, it'd be the Christian teaching that you're a human being, desired by God, willed by God. Your value is exactly equal to every other human life. So IVF and our notion as Catholics that we should not pursue it is something that cannot take away for an instant from the existence of any human being who's here. If your parents or anybody's parents brought new life into the world through IVF, there's no reason to assume anything but the very best of intentions, the very most noble kind of desire to be great parents and so forth. But both in its current medical practice and the technological capacities we have, and because of the unavoidable impact it has on families, we would say IVF crosses an ethical boundary to remove reproduction from the context of a married relationship and the act of marital intercourse and so forth. That's something which disrupts that matrix of the family. It disrupts the stability of the family, and it's a slippery slope down to some much scarier things. Once again, part of your assignment is to engage in some discussion posts that Mr. Mahalik going to outline for you on the assignments page. Think about this subject. Think about how we consider the family in society, as well as from the perspective of Christian revelation. And think about how IVF impacts the way that we think about family and reproduction, despite the best of intentions. Think about the impact that IVF would unavoidably have on how we think about family and how we think about that unbreakable bond between biological children and their parents. All the best to you the next couple of days, guys, and I'll talk to you again soon.